Once again to Android Developer Office Hours. My name is Joe Mallon. I'll be your moderator today. Next to me is Trevor Johns, and also with me is Alex Lucas. We have Tim Bray also here, and Daniel Pham is our engineer. There's Tim. So without further ado, let's get started with questions from Google Moderator. We have several questions on the order of sensors are fragmentation. I'll read them and then let Tim and others answer. Can some sensor testing be introduced on devices that Google approves by allowing the Play Store on the device? This would ensure more standardized behavior. Many LG and Samsung accelerometers return the same invalid value when screen is off. And there's other questions to that regard as well. Somebody want to answer?
So yeah, I'll address that. Can people hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. So to start with, at one level, it's even worse than you think it is, because if you look carefully at the Android compatible device definition, it doesn't actually require that an Android device have any sensors at all. And one of the reasons for that is that it also applies to things like Google TVs that aren't going to have accelerometers or anything like that. So it's absolutely the case that if you're going to write code that depends on sensors, you're going to have to do some probing and testing to see if the sensor is there. You may even want to get a little bit more subtle, because people who've done this kind of stuff have noticed that if you're doing motion-related stuff, it makes a big difference whether the phone has a gyroscope or not. You get immensely better quality data if there's a gyroscope. For some cases, you might even decline to run if there's no gyroscope, for example. Now, having said all that, what the person who's asking here, Jan, something like that. Yeah. Jan, are you one of the people I can see? If so, wave.
No, doesn't look like it.
Not as far as I can tell.
Nope.
Okay. Somebody else just joined. Anyhow, so what Jan was really driving at was, should we try and crack down on apparent incompatibilities between one model and the next? And the current compatibility test suite does have some tests that I've tried on a few devices, and they're actually pretty good for the accelerometer and the gyroscope. In particular, when I use them, I noticed some little quirks I observed in particular hardware, but not that many. There's also some basic tests with the API to check. So let me say a few things in general. First of all, empirically, I see that there's quite a few decent apps out there that make excellent use of the sensors, in particular the accelerometer and the gyroscope. So whereas there are some compatibility issues here, we see that people have successfully worked around them and got really good results. So yeah, maybe a little harder than we'd all like it to be, but you can actually do it. Another thing I should point out is that the compatibility test suite is one of the most open sourcey parts of Android. The whole thing is open source. It's developed in an open source way, and anybody who observes something they think is really wonky in an Android device, hey, it would be a really good idea to pull together a suite test and submit it to the project. I suspect those guys would be, quite open to looking at it. The final point somebody made was that they observed issues where sensors were giving wonky values when the screen was off, which means probably the device is just lying there not doing anything. I hadn't actually noticed that. I looked around, I also didn't see actually any live bugs filed on that one. Perhaps the reason there is that all the work that I did on sensor programming was, waving the thing around, capturing motions.
So in this case, it would be as simple as not doing anything to the back. Leave it as is. Whatever was in there previously, still be here.
There's some interesting noise coming from the Hangout there. Do you just want to mute everyone else, Dan?
Yeah, I'm going to go.
And just a reminder for those of you who are joining us live.
Hold on for a second, Tim.
Yeah, just a reminder for those of you who are joining us live, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. There's a little button in the upper right-hand corner of Google+. Go ahead and hit that. Otherwise, it gets a little bit hard to hear what people are saying in here.
I'm still hearing something.
Yeah, we can hear somebody laughing. Hello.
It's the gentleman with the black hair and the red shirt there.
right.
Don't worry, I'm on it, guys. Just
Okay.
do your thing.
Okay,
Right.
where was it? Okay, so yeah, so there was complaints about devices, about complaints when the thing is asleep. I can't speak to that one. I haven't observed that one. There may in fact be bugs there, and I'll tell you, I do not believe there are tests in the CTS about that. So
Okay.
that's something we
I
should
would
look at.
I would add that
Well-
if you are using sensors and you run into something which you think is a bug or is not working the way you think it should be working, you should file a bug. Okay. Not everything that's out there that you encounter is deliberate. So when in doubt, you should file a bug, and it's either a bug or it's some aspect of expected behavior. And if it is a bug, we can get to fixing it or addressing it. Any other comments?
No, I think
All right.
I think that's good.
All right, let me move to the next question on moderator, unless we have somebody in the Hangout that wants to ask a question. No.
We do have a pretty full hangout. So also, just a reminder
Right.
for those of you who are joining us live, you are welcome to join us via Hangout, ask questions. We're here to answer them. If you are joining in via the Hangout, we assume that you are going to ask a question. We only have 10 slots at a time, and it looks like it's getting pretty full, so we're going to ask those 10 of you to actually start asking questions here in short order. Otherwise, we'll have to start kicking some of you off to make room for people who do have questions. That being said, the live feed is available via YouTube as well, so that way everybody who is watching and doesn't have a question can view us that
Right.
way.
In summary, if you want to watch and be ready to ask a question, if you've got one, go to YouTube.
No, go
If-
to Hangout if they have a question.
Well, hold on. If you don't have a question right now, go to YouTube and you can watch live. Then, if you've got a question, jump into the Hangout. If you're waiting to ask a question, stay in the Hangout.
Right.
Okay? Do we have any questions waiting?
We have Jared. I'm going to put him on momentarily.
Okay.
All right, Jared, you're on. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm in my app. I'm working with a whole bunch of background threads, and I'm starting to really have some issues with race conditions and trying to figure out which thread is doing what and that sort of thing. I just started looking at Traceview a couple days ago, and it is incredibly difficult to try and make any sense of what it actually gives me. Is there a recommended practice or a different tool perhaps that might make a little more sense?
Well, so Traceview is more for performance optimizations. It gives you an idea of when your app is drawing to the screen, when it is actually using CPU, things like that. It's not so good at seeing interactions between threads. And really, there's not too much that's really going to do a good job of visualizing that for you. Your best tool really there is the debugger built into your IDE, whether it's Eclipse or IntelliJ or using the Java debugger on the command line. Race conditions are always notoriously difficult to debug. They're always a little bit painful, unfortunately, and that's just the nature of concurrent programming. So I really don't have too much to say that's going to make that really easy for you, other than just use a standard debugger and try and sort things out that way.
Okay.
I assume this is just an ordinary race condition within your code. There's nothing having to do with the GPU or the Android
specifically what's
system.
happening is I have a class that takes messages for data to post to the database, in batches, and under certain conditions it actually slows down the UI. I'm presuming because I'm synchronizing data, certain function calls and stuff like that.
Okay, so, well, if it's slowing down the UI, your UI should be on a self-contained UI thread. You shouldn't be
Right.
doing any data operations there. So,
Which it is, but I think that's what's happening is when it goes to actually write the data to the database, it synchronizes on the class, and I think that the UI is
okay.
not able to get data from it.
Gotcha.
In the meantime.
Right,
But
so,
I've been trying to verify that.
I did a ton of research on concurrency a couple of years ago, and a few remarks. So the Java model of concurrency, which Android inherits, is sort of pessimal. It allows for shared immutable state, which makes multi-threaded things really, really hard to think about and understand. And if you start to have like a lot of different mutexes and so on, you're very likely going to end up in a situation where it's going to become nearly impossible to understand what's going on. So one thing I would strongly recommend would be to go and read a couple of good short essays on functional programming, which is sort of the best technique we know about to avoid having to think about this stuff. To the extent that you can make your code purely functional, you dodge all this kind of stuff. I would also go type the name Doug Lea, Doug Lea, into Google and read a couple of the things that he wrote. He is, maybe our leading thinker on how to do this stuff without sticking your head up your ass, which I've done a few times, and probably there's some really helpful stuff in there. One particular thing I will say is that if you can go through one of the built-in things like async task or intent service or something like that, they are really, really fully debugged on this stuff, and they're less likely to barf on your thread pools than
Right.
code you write yourself.
I have a question about this, Jared, right?
Yeah.
Which is you're trying to run multiple threads to write to the database?
Well, so specifically the model is I have a thread that manages all the access to the database. It's my single connection with the database.
Uh-huh.
And it basically in its run loop, at the start of it checks to see if there's any pending data to write. If there is, it writes it, then it sleeps for a certain amount of time. And meanwhile, other things can post data in, but when it goes to write the data, I have it synchronize on itself, which may actually be where the problem is. But my idea was I didn't want it to, because there's a lot of data, specifically is weather data. I don't want it to start writing and then get an update halfway through and write stuff that doesn't correspond to the same timestamp. So I'm trying to figure out maybe there's a way that I can read data without synchronizing on it, but write data without. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
So I just looked and I noticed that the Android SDK includes the java.util.concurrent class.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might be well served by going and diving into that one and looking, because it gives you things like thread pools, synchronization, and queues that things off the front of the queue, and it's all well debugged code. And to the extent that you can use that might help.
Jared, are you doing this work right now on an async task?
No, the problem I have with the async task is because that's all basically a thread pool. I have other parts that function on the UI that use async tasks, and it was interfering with that. Like if I couldn't do the database right and maintain, at least I couldn't think of a way of maintaining the one connection to the database through an async task and making sure that all the writing happened in the background.
Okay.
I'm probably,
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer because without knowing more about what exactly you're trying to do, we would.
Right. I'm trying to. I could use a content provider. I'm sure that would simplify a lot of things, but I don't actually have need of a content provider aside from.
I honestly.
So if it makes you feel any better, what you're trying to do is well known to be a hard thing.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I know that. I originally I programmed in C++, so it's even worse. I think. But, I was hoping there might be some sort of tool that specifically for monitoring threads.
No, and I don't think a content provider would help you all that much because that's just a lightweight. In a lot of respects, it's just a lightweight shell around the database anyway. You'd still run into the problems that you're running into.
Basically, I tried to implement my own thread pool around the database, and I probably just didn't do a very good job of it.
Okay. Any other comments or ideas that we can provide?
I think that's covered quite a bit.
Yeah.
I'll take a look at the concurrent classes. That sounds like it might be a good place to start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have another user in the Hangout who wants to ask a question. His name is Martin. I'm going to put Martin on.
Please do. Hello, Martin.
Hey, guys.
Howdy.
Oh, Hey, I want to touch the sensors a little more since that's basically the topic today. So we were talking about the accelerometer in particular not working in the background of some devices, right? So there is a ton of devices and reports surrounding that, but there's also a fairly easy solution that works on some devices. You basically restart the accelerometer when you receive a screen off broadcast. The problem there is, or the question would be, so in some devices even that does not work. So if you hold the partial wake lock on the device, should that let me restart the accelerometer or not?
That's a good question, and I don't think the behavior there is actually specified as part of the API. I suspect what you've probably found is something that works by chance, but not by design. So it's difficult to say exactly. Just to be clear, when you say in the background, do you mean your app is no longer in the foreground, or do you mean you've actually shut the phone completely off?
So, I mean, it doesn't even matter if the app's in the foreground or background, right? It's basically, it is a service, so shouldn't make any difference. Because what we've noticed is on some phones, when you press the power button, right, and you turn the screen off, that automatically shuts down the accelerometer as well. So what you do is you basically listen for the screen off broadcast, you actually need to wait for a couple of seconds, and then restart the accelerometer, right? So the expected behavior or the documented thing would be, even for the wake lock, right? The partial wake lock should keep at least the processor running, and I would expect that by default it would enable you to enable other stuff as well, right?
That would have been my expectation as well. Yes.
It feels like it's not enabled, or it's not like it works by chance. It feels like it's disabled by design on some of the devices.
I wouldn't be surprised. The CDD doesn't say anything about that.
Right.
And I can imagine some system builder deciding to just turn it off when the power goes off, because sort of self-defense against developers who don't do the right thing.
Right. Yeah. So when I say it works by chance, I'm not saying that you're running into some scenario that hasn't been conceived of somewhere by some engineer. It's just not part of the standard Android design. So we specify what things need to look like at the surface level, what the API to developers looks like. But as far as how things like device drivers are implemented, that's a lot of that is left up to device manufacturers out of necessity. And it's possible somebody just thought, oh, well, it's leaving the accelerometer running when the screen is off consumes a lot of battery power. So let's just go and terminate any accelerometer listeners that are waiting. And they probably just, maybe they didn't think of the implications of that, or maybe they really don't want you to do that. Who knows? But in any case, it's not the behavior here isn't something that we specify in the API. I do agree, though, that the right thing probably is to leave the accelerometer running as long as you hold a wake lock. So generally speaking, when you run into bugs like this, we want to get something into the CDD and the CTS to go and make sure that the behavior is really well specified. And basically that means filing a bug. So if you go to b.android.com, that's usually our recommendation. Open up a bug there, and if you're really ambitious, you can actually go so far as to submit a patch. Now, since you brought this up here, I'll make sure that does get filed for you. Now, which device in particular were you working with?
I have an Excel spreadsheet somewhere I can send it to.
But just generally, do most of them turn off, or do most of them stay on?
I would say it's kind of a 50-50 situation.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it works. I had problems actually on a Google device. I think that Galaxy S, or Nexus S, pardon, was problematic in that regard.
What's the use case? I mean, I'm assuming that you want to be able to control when the accelerator, or at least detect when the accelerator is going to turn off by saying, okay, if I have a wake lock, then it shouldn't turn off. So what are you trying to accomplish by this?
So here's the use case, right? I want to monitor, let's pretend I want to monitor your activity during the day, right? So I have a service that's in the background, and every time you turn off the screen, the accelerometer goes off. What we do here in our case is we acquire a new wake lock, a new partial wake lock, because it appears that you need to acquire a new one because the old one wannabe expires. That happened on several devices. So you listen for the screen off broadcast. You acquire a new wake clock the same second. You wait for, I think waiting for 3 seconds was the sweet spot. And then we go to the accelerometer and say, hey, start now. And then in 99.5% of the cases, it actually works.
Really?
Some device, it's. I mean, I can understand why you would turn off the accelerometer and turn the screen off. What I don't understand is the next 0.5% of devices which ignore the wake clock that should allow you to wake the damn accelerometer.
Okay, so it seems like if we were to agree it's a bug, it would be a well characterized bug. It's the case where you're trying to turn it on when the machine is.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not sure if it's
Okay.
a bug. That's the thing.
It sounds like, I mean, it's a bug in the sense that it's behavior that's not well specified. So again, this is a really good candidate for something that we should include as part of the compatibility test suite.
Right.
So since you already have that spreadsheet, that would actually be really good data to pass along to our engineers so we can do some testing on our end.
Yeah, sure.
Probably the best thing to do, if you can go to b.android.com, just paste in whatever data you already have there, and then give us the ticket number or the issue number as a comment in, I guess in Google Plus would probably be the best place to put it, or just message me directly, Trevor Johns. I think my name might be linked to somewhere. In any case, just let one of us know what the issue number is with any information you already have, and we can go ahead and take that and pass it along. Either way, I'll make sure that somebody on the sensors team, or actually the CTS team also, is looking into this.
Right.
Yeah, sure. I can report this, no problem.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
Totally.
Thank you. Anybody else in the hangout?
Yeah, we're putting Jared back on. He's got another question.
Okay, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, this is actually a quick one. Is Logcat guaranteed to be sequential as far as the timing? Like, if the order of logs in Logcat, is that guaranteed to be the order that they were posted in the VM?
If they're on different threads...
I don't think if they're on different threads.
Well, I wouldn't bet on that.
Okay, because that would explain a lot of what's been driving me crazy.
I think Logcat has the log has a flush mechanism. I don't remember exactly, but
Okay, because I'm seeing Logcat messages that the order really doesn't make sense.
Right.
You know.
It's possible that they are getting written, in a different order than you're posting them because they're coming from different threads. If you want to get around that, maybe a good idea would be to go and include the system time when the log message is generated as part of your log message.
I would totally do that. You know, I would think that, like on a modern four-core processor, it would be really, really hard to do Logcat in a way that, something might happen, but then you get swapped out, right? Somebody else gets swapped in, and
I agree. The system time is a good way of doing it.
Okay, perfect.
Right. Does log have a flush method? Do you guys know?
No, it doesn't. I don't think so.
Okay.
so it's happening behind the scenes where you can't control it, right? Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Anyone else? I have, the reason I do this is I have to ask the engineer if there's anybody else in the hangout because I can only see one other person at a time.
Actually, I'm going to put Martin back on.
Okay, go ahead, Martin.
Okay, just another quick one. It's not related to sensors, but should be fairly easy to answer if you know anything about it. So I've been having a ton of problems with the calendar time zone thingy, and I'm wondering if there's. I've been able to find one bug report on the older phones, but I feel like it still hadn't been fixed. So you have two methods on the calendar, right, by which you can set the time zone. You have the field zone offset, right? And you have the time zone parameter with the set time zone method that actually takes the time zone object. I'm just wondering if both of those methods should work the same or not.
Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with the API to know what the difference between those two is. That's a really good question. I think we're going to have to do some research there and get back to you. I've written it down. I'll go over questions from last week at the beginning of the next show. Actually, no, I suppose we forgot to do that. I have answers to questions from last week too.
Right.
So at some point
we had agreed to let Tim.
Yeah, let's Tim do it.
And
let's keep Tim on the line here as long as we can, and then we'll go over questions from last week a little bit later.
Right.
There's some other sensor.
Yeah, we're going to get to you in just a sec. We're about to come back to you.
All right, so just to follow up on the live question, we'll do some research. We'll get back to you. Beginning of the show next week, we should have some more info for you. All right, thanks for the question.
We want to use as much time of Tim's as we can get, so we're going to move on to the moderator to get some more sensor questions. Yes, thank you. Sensor questions. Recommend best practices to get input from sensors for a long-running application with the display off that does not drain the battery.
Right. So there's a few things to watch out here for. One of the reasons why sensors drain batteries is not so much that the sensor itself consumes power, it's that it's calling you back like 100 times a second, or I think the slowest possible rate they can do is like 20 or 30 times a second. And so that's waking up your process, looking into it. And unfortunately, if you look at typical sensor callbacks, they're full of trigonometry and math libraries and floating point, and are not cheap. They so I would really totally not recommend leaving the sensor running. So if I were going to do this kind of thing, what I would do is I would put myself into a service and schedule myself to wake up every so often and turn the sensors on for 10 seconds, gather a bunch of data, and then go back to sleep. Now ideally I would not do much data processing unless there's actually a condition you're looking for to wake up. I would gather the data, stuff it in the database, go back to sleep. The ratio between the amount of time you're awake and the amount of time you're asleep, work it out. But if you're only awake, for 5% of the time, you're clearly not going to hurt the battery that much. Now, the one thing you asked about was GPS, and that's a different thing. So one thing to watch out for is while you're asleep, somebody else might have got up and opened up the maps or done something like that resulted in GPS. So what you should totally do is go and look at some of the stuff that Reto Meyer's been publishing about how to do location efficiently. And in particular, there's this thing called the passive location provider that just sort of parasitically remembers any locations that have come into other apps. And then when you wake up, if you use that, you might just get a really high quality location data right there for you without ever having to turn the GPS on. So I'm not going to reiterate all the excellent advice that Reto gave because it goes on for an hour too. It's a big subject. But so for the regular sensors, just wake up every so often. For the location, go and look and do what Reto said.
Right. I will add one more thing on GPS there too. A lot of times, what you need when you're trying to turn GPS on doesn't actually require GPS. You can use the course location provider, which will still get you actually a fairly accurate location fix, but without the power overhead of turning the GPS radio on and waiting for a satellite lock and all this other stuff, which takes time and CPU. So if you can at all get away with it, use the course location provider first. In addition to all the other stuff like using the passive location provider, and definitely look through Reto's post. But yeah, keep in mind GPS isn't your only option for location.
Okay, I'm looking for sensor-related stuff.
Yeah, there's that one. Sorry, the next one down, Joe, is actually different from the rest of his.
Actually, the next one down for, you mean Jan?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you?
So that's actually an interesting question.
Yeah, sensors for fragmentation. Could you enforce on manufacturers somewhat more standard?
No, sorry, that's not the one I'm looking at.
Oh.
The one I'm looking at says many sensors return values only when they change.
Hold on for a second.
I think that's further up. It used to be. That's it.
Yep. Here we are. Many sensors return values only when they change. Could this become part of the spec and draw a line between sensors that do just that and those capable of returning the current value as well?
Right. So Up until 4.1, no. As of now, yes. Now, I didn't actually know that. I've never used such a sensor, but in preparation for this, I was going and reading the CDD and things like that. And I gathered that in 4.1, we did introduce a new type of sensor that is what's called a streaming sensor. That you just read live values out of it. Having said that, I've never used one. And I didn't have time to go and drill down on it. So they actually had to do quite a bit of architectural work to the core sensor code, because all the stuff that had existed assumed it was all callback based. So the answer to Jan's question is yes, this could become part of spec, and it has become part of spec, but no, I don't actually have any specific concrete advice, but clearly other people share your desire for that kind of sensor.
Okay. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. Here's one that's not from anybody that has asked a question before. Are there any use cases for sensors and apps which you feel have been underutilized by developers?
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Joe. I didn't see
Are there any use cases for sensors and apps which you feel have been underutilized by developers?
Oh, absolutely. And it's what most people would call gestures, but that already has been taken by another piece of Android, so we can't call it gestures. So I've been calling them kinetics. And this is the classic case of, shake to undo, or there's a bunch of short, simple gestures you can do. Imagine such as chop left, chop forward, chop back, slap the front, slap the back, slap the side, kind of thing. And I have actually in the background been working on an app that has no screen controls at all and is entirely controlled by those kind of kinetics. And actually, I noticed, I discovered that once I got over the hump, they're not that hard to write. And there's not that many of them out in the market. So I totally recommend people doing that, because not only is it really cool when it works, it might well differentiate you from the other 500,000 or however many it is apps out in market that haven't been clever enough to do that.
Yeah. Sort of reminds me of an app I saw a while back where you could take your phone and flip it over, and so if it's face down on your desk, it would silence.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, we did a talk at Google I/O, and Ankur Kotwal and Tony Chan. Ankur wrote a little blackjack app with dealer apps and player apps, and you would fold your cards by turning them over, by turning your phone over, and you would say "hit me" by waving your hand over the phone and things like that. And it felt really great to watch it work. And when the dealer was going to turn his cards over so you could start counting, he would just flip the phone out, right? And they would flip over. And it's really, really nice. And I don't know about you, but I get tired of apps with buttons all over the screens, and trying to, reach out and hit them.
Well, I would agree with you, and I would also point out that there's a lot of circumstances in which you want to protect the device, whatever type of device it is, from the environment, which means that you can't directly use the touch screen, but you can still use the accelerometer. So, any other comments about this question? Nope. In that case, where do we stand? Or do we have anybody in the Hangout waiting for a question? All right, let's go back here and see where we are. Oop.
Actually, we have a hand just raised.
Okay.
Looks like Alex. Alex, you want to go on to the air?
Yeah, if I can.
Here we go.
Okay. Hello, Alex.
Okay. Hi. So, talking about gestures or kinetics, as you told, my question is about the better way. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, talk a little slower, please.
Yeah.
Okay. So the main question is, how do you prefer to recognize these gestures? I mean, basically you have accelerometer data. You can use a few virtual sensors like linear acceleration, and they actually provide to you the acceleration itself. And if you want to track the movement itself, to draw, for example, some symbol, you should double integrate it. And double integration, as maybe you all know, is really not accurate. As I know, the main advice is not to use integration and just to try to use raw sensor data. However, maybe is there some way or some filters, for example, which will help to make a better accuracy for tracking the movement?
So we gave a talk on more or less exactly that question at Google I/O this year. So if you go to Google I/O and look for sensitive side of Android, there's both a video and slides with lots of links. So to address what you said, I actually did a lot of this coding myself, and there's also an app I published to the Play Store called SenseFloor. There's a link to it in the talks. And what it does is it allows you to shake the phone around, and it captures a bunch of sensor data and puts it in a CSV file and emails it to you. So you can make graphs of what the values are. Now, in answer to your question, for gesture detection, there are some calculations you can do. If you save the which one is it? It's one of the sensors. It's the linear acceleration sensor. Is that the one? I'd have to go and look whichever it is. Anyhow, you can save the data, and then you can call a routine on it that will detect change in angle along the three axes, delta angle around the x, y, and z axes. And I actually found that one was the most useful in detecting simple hand gestures like shaking and twisting and that kind of stuff. You have to watch out for a bunch of things. The data is messy as it comes off the sensors, so you have to do some filtering and that kind of stuff. Now, the last thing you talked about is actually really hard. So I'd like to be able to draw letters of fire in the air or something like that. And that's really hard. The quality of the data coming out, I'm not sure that can actually be done. I tried to do that for like a month or two, and I couldn't do it. And if you look at something like the Nintendo Wii or the Kinect, the way they work is they have a fixed point, like the camera or the IR sensor or something, standing still and watching you move around. And so for them, it's actually much, much easier. So I've never actually seen a mobile app on any platform that really allows you to do good, three-dimensional motion tracking of the device. So if somebody could figure out how to do that and make it work, I think that would be a great service, but I wasn't smart enough.
Now, this reminds me of another question that I actually saw earlier in Moderator, and that was I can't remember who asked it, but the question was, are there any good libraries out there to go and do gesture detection? Since right now we just provide the low-level libraries to go and read sensor data. And now I'm not actually familiar of any libraries out there that provide prepackaged gestures. Tim, are you aware of anything?
Well, I'm aware in the negative sense in that I looked really hard for them and didn't find anything very much to speak of. There are 27 different libraries out there that will detect a shake, all by doing, the x squared plus y squared plus z squared square root, and just, detecting absolute values of acceleration. But no, I think that it's actually a fairly weak area.
Okay, so that's actually probably, even going back to the last question too, on open areas for development. And so if somebody wants to do some open source work that really benefit the community, I think this is it's an open area for development. Write a library that does gesture recognition.
Right. There's
with some prefab gestures.
Right. There was a question here from Pavel about standard sensor-based gesture recognizers as part of the API.
Yeah, that was the one.
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't know for sure, but I think we agree that the likelihood of that happening anytime soon is not high, but it's certainly a place where other people could make a contribution to Android for sure. I think, as people pointed out, not much has been done here yet, and I don't think very much has been done anywhere in the space for any types of devices yet. We just haven't gotten used to the idea that these sensors are available and can be used to communicate with devices. Jared?
I have one small sample piece of code that you might want to check out in that SenseFloor app. It's open sourced on code.google.com.
Okay.
It's got a flip recognizer to recognize flipping up and flipping back.
Okay.
It's not packaged as a shared library or anything like that. It's just a bunch of Java code, but it seems to work pretty well.
So
okay.
I actually have a comment to this, guys. It kind of goes to what Tim was talking about, where he worked on it for a long time and struggled with it. Basically, what you're talking about doing is an inertial guidance system.
Exactly.
And missiles, aircraft, rockets, they all do it. They do it incredibly well, but they're talking about something where they're measuring, they want to be a couple of feet accurate over several miles, and you're talking about, millimeters accuracy in a foot, half a meter. It could be done, but those same devices that are actually doing it, they were purpose built for that task. So their sensors are much more accurate, their analog to digital conversion's much more accurate, they're able to do a lot more processing because they have DSP chips to do all this math in much more real time. So I think in theory it's capable. I just doubt that the Android phone possesses the hardware required to do it.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Jared. Okay. Anybody else in the Hangout? Nope. Okay. Let's move on then. There's another question here from Jan in Prague. Could you enforce on manufacturers a somewhat more standardized behavior of sensors? That is, even Galaxy Nexus has issues with proximity sensors returning nonsense when covered with, say, paper.
Well, let me say just one thing specifically about proximity sensors. The proximity sensor is well known by people who've done these things to be a very blunt-edged instrument. In general, you can't count on much more than it detecting there's something in front or no, there's not something in front. Now, it claims to read out in centimeters or something like that, but in fact, it's just not up to that. I think we addressed Jan's question initially in that the CDD doesn't really promise very much, and to the extent that there are obvious glitches that really should be better, the CTS test could certainly be beefed up, and that's an open source project.
Yeah,
Right.
and I'll add one more thing on top of that too. Having done some robotics work before, sensors are very noisy, and that's the nature of the physical world, and it's just the reality of working with sensor data. We can go and give you tools like virtual sensors to go and help clean them up, but at some level there's always going to be some inaccuracy here, and there's always going to be a little bit of extra work required converting data from sensors into something very clean that your application can make sense of, and that's just the nature of the field.
Yeah, and I would also say that there's various types of sensors that you can use to do the same type of measurement. And then in robotics, at least, the question becomes which is the best one to use for your particular application. Just because you've got like a color sensor doesn't mean that that's necessarily the best way of sensing the particular quality of some material that you have in front of you. There might be another sensor that you could choose that is better for that particular application. And those are the sort of trade-offs that you make in robotics all the time.
Let me make two specific points.
Go ahead.
On the Android devices, it seems to be the conventional wisdom that the highest quality sensor is the gyroscope. The data that comes out of the gyroscope is generally considered to be, relative to all the others, cleaner and nicer and easier to work with. Second thing is that for every category of sensor data I tracked pretty well, I ended up having to write somewhere in the implementation a little circular buffer where instead of working with the raw sensor datum, I would end up working with the average of the last n. So that so every time you got a new one, you put it in the buffer, average the latest n, and give that value instead. And by the way, I found that n equals 5 was a really good value for a lot of sensors.
Well, that's a really good piece of advice, really good information to have. And we have one more question I'd like to get out of you, Tim. Someone posted a question that says, were there any sensor-related behind-the-scenes changes in 4.1? You mentioned one already. Are there any others that you can think of?
There was a ton of refactoring went into that. I don't know, Trevor, remember Attila was working, or Matthias Agopian was working on that, and they did a ton of work. And at some point in the flow, somewhere between ICS and Jelly Bean, the quality of the data was really qualitatively improved.
Right. Yeah, and that's not stuff that you're going to see so much in the API. It really is implementation changes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go. Since we've been hopping all over the place today, I have to sort of get my bearings here again. I think what we want to do is, if we don't have anybody else waiting for a sensor-related question in the Hangout, then we'll move on to some questions that don't necessarily involve sensors. Let's go see here. The best set of test devices. This is from Napster in India. What is the best set of test devices that an independent developer can own? For example, Nexus 7, Galaxy Nexus, Nexus S, Motorola Droid. The screen densities and API versions are my criterion. Thanks.
Okay. Actually, Alex, do you want to start off with this one?
Yeah, sure. First thing to note is that there isn't a specific set. There isn't a set of very specific devices that you want in sort of your test family. Like what you really want to be looking for is like you mentioned, a set of devices that matches the spectrum of like each of those criteria. So you want a range of API versions. You want a range of screen sizes. More important, also important is you want a range of GPUs, of graphics chips. And there's sort of these like families that you want to fall into. So probably you want like at least one tablet, one large phone, one small phone, depending on how universal you want to be, probably a Google TV. I would say go as far back as Froyo. Get a blend all the way from Froyo to Jelly Bean and new devices or devices with new API versions as they come out. And I'm sure I'm missing a couple of criteria here. Trevor?
Sorry, you mentioned what was the list you mentioned?
GPU, API version, screen size, and screen density.
Right. Yeah, I'd say those are the big ones. The GPU is one that I think a lot of people often miss because it's not something. It's something inside the phone that you don't think about. But there's 4 major GPU vendors. Try and have a device from each of those. Just because so much is hardware accelerated right now, even when you don't think you're using OpenGL, you probably are. And then otherwise, just get a good mix of phones that represent the different density buckets, screen size buckets, and API levels. The Nexus devices in general are usually pretty good ones if you're if you need something to get started with. That's what a lot of our internal development is done on for obvious reasons. It doesn't cover everything, but it does cover a pretty wide spectrum out there. And on top of that, just devices that are popular, right? If there's a lot of users using a phone, it might make sense for you to have one of those too. Now, that being said, you don't necessarily need to have a ton of phones. In fact, you definitely don't need to have a ton of phones if you want to do Android development, right? We try very hard to go and make sure that everything behaves consistently across devices, but there are cases, especially with things like textures and OpenGL, where you tend to see a bit more differences because of the nature of GPUs. So just watch out for that. One thing, if you do want to get access to a lot of different devices and you don't have a big budget, of course there is the emulator. If you're just doing basic API level testing, screen size testing, the emulator will get you access to all of that. You don't need physical devices in many cases. But if you do find that you do, there are a number of third-party vendors that provide remote access to the devices. So off the top of my head, I think Device Anywhere and Bitbar are 2 really popular ones. They have very different products, but you pay them a small fee and upload your APK to them, and they'll go and either let you run it on individual devices one at a time or run automated tests across an entire suite of devices. And you can get some really good data that way too.
I would say one other thing is also don't discount the fact that you can build as many different emulators on your own local development machine as you want.
It's true. The emulator has gotten a lot better too.
Right. So you can build a Gingerbread device of any size. You can build a Jelly Bean device of any size, any density you want. It's not at a point where you can emulate any GPU chip you want. So you can't have an NVIDIA next to a Qualcomm next to a whatever.
No.
But you can have automate a thing where you spin up a tablet emulator next to a phone emulator, take a couple of screenshots, and then compare afterwards, or run a test suite.
Yep, and if you haven't used the emulator in quite a while or haven't been following the developments there, we've added hardware acceleration as well as virtualization support. And basically that means the emulator has actually gotten to the point where it's not painful to use. It actually feels as fast as a normal phone in a lot of cases. So it really is a useful development tool. And if you don't find yourself using an emulator, now might be a good time to give it another try.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Hey guys, a couple of people in the Hangout are just asking for a recap from last week, and they're
yes.
interested in hearing
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Excellent.
Let's do that now.
All right. So, not so much a recap, but a list of questions we couldn't answer. So there were 2 of those from last week. The first one was a question about actually, for those who weren't with us last week, the topic was web development on Android. And one of the questions was about a library that was announced at Google I/O for syncing preferences across different devices. And in particular, they wanted to know if there were any updates on that. So I spoke to Yaniv, who was the engineer who gave the talk where that was announced. He told me that the team is still working on it. They don't have anything that they can announce at this time, but it still is under active development, so hopefully sometime in the near future you'll hear something. Just stay tuned and we'll let you know as soon as there's something new that we can share there. The other question was about parsing JSON data on devices with limited memory. And so, in particular, are there any streaming stack style parsers for JSON? And we have two recommendations for you. The first one is actually already built into Android. So as of Honeycomb, API level 11, we have android.util.json reader, which is a streaming JSON parser built into the system that should do exactly what you want. Now, if you're on a device that's pre-Honeycomb, we would recommend using a library called JSON. So G is in Google, right? So and it turns out that JSON reader is actually derived from JSON. So the two have very similar interfaces. So if you're looking for something that's backwards compatible and easy to either swap out at runtime or upgrade to later, JSON's definitely a good choice. And we picked it for the framework, so can't go too wrong. And that were the two unanswered questions from last week.
Okay. Now, we had also talked about some audio problems that we had at the beginning of last week.
Yes.
Will people be able to look at the YouTube?
They will once
recording?
the YouTube video goes up. I believe there's Daniel can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's some processing errors and it's still, or some processing delays rather, and it's still in the queue waiting to get uploaded. So we do have a recording of it, and as soon as or if for some reason YouTube isn't able to go and post the video, we can just post the recorded version.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct as far as I know. I actually have another question from the Hangout real quick.
Go ahead.
Before we close for today. I'm going to put Akil on. I think that's how you pronounce it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Please do.
1 second. Oops. That's you guys. There you go.
There he is.
Howdy.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a follow-up question to last week's question. I'm a beginner to Android development, and I've been using the API guides, not straight through though. But do you have any suggestions on some good parts of it that I should make sure I have covered? Like, I have done the fundamentals in the activity section, except for like loaders and some user interface stuff. But I'm having trouble differentiating what is something to read for reference later, or what are the fundamentals.
Right.
So,
I remember this question from last week.
Yeah. Well, I think the question last week was actually... Well, yeah, no, there were two questions recently. One was, what would be good things to read? And the other one was, would you recommend reading through all of the API guide in order? Yeah, so, I mean, fundamentals is definitely a good place to start. That's why it's called fundamentals, right? Loaders, you'll definitely want to read up on loaders and UI when you get a chance, both of which are extremely important for modern Android development. I guess UI has always been important. As far as other things worth noting, now SQLite I can't remember if that's part of the fundamentals section or not, but you'll definitely need to be familiar with that. Other things worth knowing, Binder is probably not something you need to know to begin with, but something you'll probably run into eventually, since that's the RPC mechanism for Android. Let's see, what are some other really good sections worth noting? Shared preferences, definitely a good section to read up on. Let's see, what else?
I would say that it's difficult to sort of give you detailed advice without knowing what sort of things you're trying to do. If you're just trying to learn everything there is to know about Android, my approach to it is always to suggest that people pick a project that they want to do and then go off and try to do it. And in addition, read the API guides as you go along trying to do that project to learn about activities and how activities interact with each other. If I was going to name it, I would say activities, intents, services, and also shared preferences and
fragments, probably.
Oh, fragments definitely.
Yeah.
Fragments might be very useful as well. I think you can wait on those until after you've gotten through some simple exercises. And keep in mind that we have a whole set of Android training that you can do in conjunction with any of the API guides that you read.
Right.
I would say to get a solid foundation, the Android training is sort of split into a basic training section and an advanced topic section. Basic training is the stuff that everyone should try to learn all of.
Yeah.
Because it's the stuff that comes up in almost every Android application past a certain size that you're going to write. The advanced topic stuff is also very useful to know, but it only matters to your application some of the time. So I would say definitely cover the getting started section of Android training, and that'll cover like a really good solid foundation for you.
Yeah, and then the training section is probably a little bit closer to what you're trying to do too. That's the section that really is meant to be read sequentially, whereas the API guide and especially the reference are more reference material, right? You jump to the sections you need as you need them.
Yeah, I'm writing a course organizing app for like students and stuff. Like that's what I'm like. I realized that I should have a project to work on while I'm doing. So I was just wondering like what should I like basically cover and then what the next thing to do. But like thanks for like shedding some light on that. That really helps.
Great, thank you. Do we have anybody else out there?
Nope.
Okay. Do we have time for one last question?
I think we could spare another minute or so. We're a little over time, but that's not a problem.
Okay. You want to try and tackle this last question here, sitting here?
Then we can go ahead and do it. I mean, there's not much I can say on that, but let's go ahead.
Let's at least read it. It took 3 weeks for developer to support to respond and reinstate the Reddit sync application after a trademark misunderstanding. What are you doing to enhance developer relations and fix these unacceptable response times from support?
Okay, so like I said, I can't say too much on this particular issue. App reviews are private issues between us and the developer in question. We have been in contact with that developer, and we have been since the beginning. So there is definitely a dialogue going on there. I just can't really publicly say what's going on there. Like I said, it's between us and the developer. In general, though, I mean, first off, we are aware that there was some concern in the community about this particular app, and we're looking at what we can do there to improve the process in the future. And on a more general note, I just want to emphasize, if you are a developer on Google Play, make sure you read through the terms of services and make sure that you don't have anything in your app which either violates those or our content guidelines, because then the review team can't get involved, and it's sort of a messy situation for everyone involved. It's something that's best to avoid if possible. But again, we are aware of this particular case, and we're looking into ways to improve it for the future, improve the process for the future. I think that pretty much covers everything we can say on that.
Okay. Any other comments for today? All right. With that, we will say goodbye to you and see you again this time next week. Please send in your questions to moderator, and if you want to ask us questions on the air, please feel free. Until then.
All right. See everyone.